Welcome, Sunday,
Welcome,
March
Brian.
9th. How's everyone doing?
Nice.
Good.
Good.
I thought today I would continue on this road of filter tuning.
There is any type of filters for each type of quad where we start for each size. 3.5, 5 inches.
Let me rephrase your question. You're asking, is there some set of filter settings that we should start with, depending
Yes.
on the size of the drone? There's one thing you could do, and that is to set the RPM minimum frequency. Let's go into Betaflight really quickly, and I'll show you that. By default, this is your filter setup. So overall, most of this is going to be fine to start with for almost any drone, but the key one you want to look at is the RPM filter. So what you're going to find is that for larger drones with a prop size of, say, greater than 7-inch, you're going to want to drop this a little bit. Now, where exactly to put that is questionable, but I would say the safe bet would be to drop it down to about 70 hertz for anything from an 8-inch to 11-inch or so. And then maybe lower if you have a larger rig than that. But, you know, for most people, 11 inch is probably about as big as it's gonna get. You know, the most common drones out there now in the hobbyist world is probably a 5-inch, and then above that is probably a 7-inch, as common for long range. So for a 7-inch, probably somewhere around 75 hertz is a good starting point. And maybe for something like a 10-inch, maybe a bit lower. It just depends on the power to weight ratio to some degree. Because what's going to happen basically is the lowest frequency of the motors at the lowest throttle, right, besides idle, at the lowest throttle, say hover point, is going to be pretty low for a 10-inch, right? So all you're trying to do there is to make sure that you're covering the bases, right? You want to make sure that you're filtering that first harmonic. Why does that matter? Because there are some cases where if you had this at 100 and your first motor band is, say, at 70 hertz or so, that's going to be just basically blasting through the system, and it could lead to a flyaway. So there's the only danger. Now, when you go smaller than a 5-inch, it doesn't matter. The 100 hertz cutoff will still be a safe starting point, right?
Okay.
But ultimately, for a smaller than a 5-inch, you could probably get by with this much higher. But you don't have to worry about that until you actually see data. So when you see the results, then you can decide on where to put that. But just know that at default, for a larger rig, anything greater than 7-inch, you're going to want to drop this down something, 70, 60 maybe. By the way, the lowest this will go is 50. So if I try to drop this lower than 50, 45, it'll just stick it at 50, right? I'm not sure if the CLI would allow you to drop it lower or not. I'm just going to see. So 30 to 200 is the range. Yeah.
And the dynamic notch goes to 20.
Yeah. Okay.
Brian, I have one question. I probably spoke about it before, but I can't recall right now what was the actual answer for that. So the question is why it's important if the dynamic notch for RPM filter is set exactly how the RPM are. So what's the difference how we will set it as a minimal and maximum value if it's always set as RPM, if the filter notch is equal to RPM that is actually at the current time. So if the RPM starts with the drone lift off at, I don't know, 100 hertz RPM, so the notch will not go lower anyway, because that's the lift off frequency of the RPM.
Yeah. So I didn't quite get your question, but I think I know what you're asking.
I can rephrase it. So why we set the minimum RPM notch filter, why we set it to higher value for smaller rigs? We cannot leave it 50 hertz.
Yeah.
I mean, the dynamic notch is always set as the RPM are.
Yeah.
So it will never go that low, because that will never happen. So Can we just leave it on 50 hertz? And
No, you're going to get a lot high filter delay when you drop to idle. Take a spinning prop and you drop the RPM. At some point, it actually doesn't produce much energy. So it certainly has a specific RPM. So if it was making noise, it would be at that RPM, but it's not generating any energy. And so the Betaflight developers realized that why have RPM filters active when you go all the way down to idle or when you drop the throttle really low? So what the developers did was create a thing called crossfade. And what crossfade does is it says as the frequency of the motor, RPS, right, the hertz of the motor, starts to approach the minimum point that you set, there's a little dial that turns down their attenuation strength. And the reason for it is that it fades them out because that way it reduces all that filter delay as all those notches go into the lower frequencies. And the reason you can get away with it is because as the notches approach the idle speed, they don't generate much actual vibration anyway. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the spectrum, you'll notice that when you're on the ground, you're idling. You'll notice that as you increase the throttle, you look at the spectrum and you can see the spectrum is kind of invisible and slowly starts to come up to some nominal point where you can start to see it in the spectrogram. Okay. So the same is true for a little. Let's think about your scenario now. You were saying, imagine you have a small prop whose hover frequency is say 200 hertz, but whose idle frequency is probably 150 hertz. You see what I mean? So you're idling at 150. Those little props are not going to generate any vibration at that point. Why have notches active? So that's why you can raise the min. Now, if you didn't do that and you had the min down at 100, you drop down at idle and you're going to have a lot of filter delay. And that filter delay is going to cause all these prop wash wobbles and stuff when you...
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you.
Hey, Brent.
Yeah.
Something I've always wanted a little more, I guess, understanding on. And can you give us some understanding as to the number of harmonics when we go from, biblade, triblade, quad blade, or higher, right? Like, I know there's some data there.
You mean the number of motor harmonics that are generated?
Yeah. How to adjust filtering based off of that, like when you are changing props, especially like Cine whoops are a good example, right? Like some guys run 5 or 6 blades, some guys run 4 blades, some guys run 3 blades. Like we have varieties of how we outfit builds. So
yeah, I'll tell you what, it's not super clear why this is the case, but it tends to be that, for example, a biblade will generate a lot more harmonics than a triblade, which will generate more harmonics than a quad, and so on. I never really understood why that's the case, but that doesn't matter to me too much. There's probably a physics expert that would know something about that. The main issue is the biblade really starts to generate more harmonics than the RPM filters can actually address. Fortunately, those harmonics just tend to go into higher and higher frequencies, so it doesn't matter too much because by the time you get up past the third harmonic, low-pass filters will take care of it pretty well. Not to mention that the magnitude of those harmonics is not super intense anyway, right?
So how would you handle a biblade for like a high speed setup in terms of managing that those extra harmonics and what are some good things to look for in practice, right?
It's a good question. So you might be tempted to use dynamic notches, but this brings us to the topic that I wanted to talk about, which if you have a high-speed rig like you're describing, what you're going to find is you'll probably have your 3 main harmonics, plus you'll maybe have a 4th or a 5th, and in a high-speed rig, those 4th and 5th harmonics are going to be even way up in the high frequencies, maybe 6, 7, 800 hertz, maybe higher. The problem with trying to use a dynamic notch for that is you'd have to set the maximum frequency of the dynamic notch a lot higher. And while it's tempting to do that, doing that will in fact create a new problem for you. And that is that you're going to lose precision on those dynamic notches. Now, in some cases, that might not matter.
I do see what you're talking about in terms of the additional noise and harmonics. Funny enough, they actually don't get too high. Uh, it's actually, I'm seeing at full throttles in noise, but it's not super high in the spectrum. It's actually more low. Like, it's hard to get the low end because you are on a high speed setup, filtering so high to try to deal with.
Well, you could be looking at resonance peaks, right? So just to be clear about what you're looking at first, you can't really decide on it until you know what the peak actually is.
Right. But I was just curious. It was more of, again, just like, I was also thinking in terms of Cinewhoops and stuff, like, some of the smaller stuff I tend to use like tri-blades versus 5 blades, because I find that if you can get a tri-blade dialed in better, you do give up a little bit of thrust, but you get so much lower of a noise floor that you get so much cleaner of a tune anyways, so you can tighten it up more. So anyways, I think that's where
that's a good point. That's a good point. So on a lot of these Cinewhoops have become very popular, and sometimes they use 5 or 6 blade props. And usually with those 5 blade props, you'll only generate a single harmonic, but sometimes it's a really intense harmonic, just the first, right? So you might not get better flight characteristics even though you only have 1 motor band, right? And so what you're saying is sometimes going to a nice light tri-blade and you lose some thrust, but you get better flight. Fair enough. Yeah. You just do that. There's nothing wrong with that. I have sometimes found it really interesting, though, that a 5 or 6 bladed prop can have so few harmonics. And if that first harmonic is not too intense, it seems like that would be a good option. The other thing that's nice about a 4 or 5 bladed prop, too, is it tends to grip a little more. You have a little more drag, I suppose. But some people really like them, so it just depends. But, yeah.
Cool.
But the topic of dynamic notches. So I thought I would chat a little bit about that. So somebody asked me a while ago why. I think they were trying to filter out a resonance peak in the low frequencies, and they were having trouble understanding why it wasn't working. I wish I had the data here. Let me go into Betaflight first, and I'll show you something about this. So if you're curious about dynamic notches and how they work, let's talk a little bit about that. So I'm not a super expert on this, by the way. I know what I know, and I'm going to be, and what I don't know, I'm going to qualify it a little bit. But let's start with the little tab down here. So this is our dynamic notch setup, okay? What do dynamic notches do? So they, like RPM filters, they use a notch, just like a gyrostatic notch. But what they do that's different is it's how they center that notch, the frequency at which they put the notch, let's say, right? So the way the dynamic notch filter works is Betaflight is continually computing the spectrum, much like you see in the spectrum of PID Toolbox, but in a very coarse way, like very coarse. So when you're doing offline analysis through PID Toolbox, we can see the spectrum in all of this fine detail, really fine-grained detail across the spectrum. When Betaflight does this, it does it in a way more coarse way, like really coarse. But now, how coarse is it? So if I go across here, there's probably 5,000 bins across all this. I don't know exactly how many. There's a way I can compute that to find it out, but there's a lot of fine-grained detail in there. Can anybody tell me how many bins Betaflight is computing the spectrogram on for the dynamic notch? Any ideas? Like 1,000?
That's 128. Just a wrong guess.
That's a good guess. It's actually close. It's 36. Yeah.
136.
No, just 36. 36.
36, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. 28. Okay.
Yeah. So it's computing the spectrogram across just 36 bins. So in other words, if you were going to compute from 0 to 1,000 hertz, you divide that by 36. Let's just do that. 1,000 divided by 36. That equals 27.7 hertz bins. In other words, from 0 to 27.778, it's going to take all that information, put it into one bin. So if there's any discrepancy, if there's a peak at, say, 10 hertz, but there's nothing at, say, 15 hertz, it's just going to average those together. So you can see how when you're putting all that information in one bin, you're losing resolution. You don't really know what's going on between that. So the next bin would be from 27 to 54, then 54 to... So that's the resolution we're working with. Now, you have a min frequency and a max frequency. Now, this max frequency in particular is really important because you only have 36 bins to work with. So if you set that max frequency higher, like 1,000, your bin width, as I said, is going to be 27 hertz. That's pretty wide. You're losing resolution there. If instead I set that max hertz to 500, then Betaflight's going to compute that based on 500. That's the max it's going to look at. So it's going to divide those 36 bins in a smaller window of frequency. So now the bin width is 13 hertz. Imagine if I drop it even more, say 200, not saying you should do that, but if you did that, then your bin width is going to be even sharper. So what that means is you don't ideally want to set this max hertz too high. If you set it too high, you're going to lose resolution. And if you need resolution because you think you have really narrow peaks of noise, Betaflight might not see them if you set that max frequency too high, right? So there's a trade-off that's playing out here, you know. Now you might say, why can't they do more than that? Well, largely because of CPU power. It takes a lot to do this computation. And I've talked to Yen, who's the developer of this, and he said we could probably do more than 36 bins. It'd be kind of nice if we had the option to change those things, but that's kind of where they converged with that 36 bin with level, right? So that's partly where it does that. So it computes the spectrum, and then what the dynamic notch does from that spectrum then is it looks at where there's peaks. So it'll look at the biggest peak, then look at the next peak, and then the next peak, and so on. And the notches will go in that order. So if you only have one notch set, it's just going to find the highest peak. If you have two notches, it's going to find the next peak, and then the next peak, and so on. And I believe another thing it does is it doesn't just center the notch then at the peak. It actually centers it at the weighted average of peaks. So you might have one peak here and another peak here. This one will get more weight than that one. So it won't, so it's not like if you have 36 bins, you wouldn't want the dynamic notch to only potentially go in one of 36 places. It can go between bins as well because of the weighted average, right? That's the extent of my knowledge of the dynamic notches. But I think, do you guys have any questions about that?
Just to resume, if I have correctly understood, if we reduce the range, we can increase the precision of the dynamic notch. In addition, we will let some motor noise entering into the system, but we have also the gyro low pass to clean up. Do you see what I mean?
I think so. I mean, okay. That's what I was saying. Yeah, if you're better off not allowing too much range on the dynamic notches if you need that precision. Now, in some cases, though, some of the noise peaks that you could be seeing are wider, and it tends to be the case that motor noise has more width as you go up in frequency.
Can you rephrase?
So if you look at motor bands, when you look at your motor noise on a spectrogram, you'll notice that your first harmonic looks like a narrow peak, and your second is broader, and the third looks broader.
Yeah.
That is actually normal. That happens, right? And there's a good explanation for that, really. It's interesting. But so when you have motor noise that's spanning a certain range, say 100 to 150 hertz, suppose you have a narrow band that goes from 100 to 150 and it's all motor, the octave of that is going to be 200 to 300, right? Because 150, double 150 is 300. So that's a wider range. And then the octave of that again is going to be 300 to 600.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So it just tends to be that as you go up in frequency, the motor noise is wider. And so I think that if you're trying to target something in higher frequencies with dynamic notches, you can allow the max frequency a little higher to deal with that. The problem comes in when you're trying to get the dynamic notches to target little tiny peaks that are down, very narrow peaks that are in low frequencies, right?
I have a question. So I always thought static notches were something, formerly used, and it's not good to use them and stuff like that. And I was curious and started to experiment with static notches, especially on frame resonances, which have, solid 185 hertz, all throttle values. And I found that they were much more precise, those static notches. And if you, play around a bit with cutoff. And
are you saying static notches are much
static
more
notches, yeah.
Yeah, of course they're more precise because you specify exactly where they're going to go, yeah.
And I read someone saying that they introduced a lot of effects on either delay and some like the biquad filters, and there are a lot of rumors around those static notches why you just don't use them and switch over to the more modern dynamic notches, which I think is not true.
The difference is the way they determine determine the width is different. So you can use a Q factor or you can use a cutoff. So if we go into and look at your static notches, what do you get with a static notch? You have something called a center frequency, and you have a cutoff frequency. Okay, you have a cutoff.
That's basically the width of the filter, right?
Right, but make no mistake, that's another way of determining the width, right? And we know that the width of the notch matters for filter delay.
Right.
Right. Now there is a formula to compute back and forth between Q and what the width is there. But keep in mind that, gyro notch filters, if you just use a static and you have a wide filter, you're going to generate a lot of delay. So I know when you get a Q, lower than say 150, you're going to really start increasing filter delay quite quickly. When it comes to a cutoff frequency, I don't know anymore. But that's fair enough. You can test it, But here's the negative side about a notch filter, a static notch, is that most resonant frequencies are not going to be fixed all the time. And especially if it's a very narrow peak. If it's something that's down in lower frequencies, it's really narrow and hard to target. And if it's only spans, say, 10 hertz wide, and you want to put this narrow notch on it, and it could move by 5 hertz. 5 hertz is enough to bring it out of the realm of that notch. And now all of a sudden it's a problem again, right? I've seen this happen a lot with camera resonance issues on cine lifters.
In my case, it was the arms were resonating at 184, 85 hertz. I could measure that with pinging them. And when I put the static notch exactly on that frequency and then I started with a cutoff of 140, and introduced quite some delay. And then I went up to 150, 160, and then there was a sweet spot where it introduced just like a microsecond or something and completely hit that frame resonance down. And that was done by experiment.
Yeah, but then what happens if the temperature changes? Anything.
Good question.
All materials are going to change.
Yeah.
And what happens when it gets a little older and you have a crash and your carbon starts to, it's just.
It's a long range setup. It's not supposed to crash.
If it works, it works. And I've done it. Don't get me wrong, right? I've done it. But in a lot of cases, I've seen the problem where I've done that. And then a client comes back and says, holy shit, I almost had a flyaway. And I'm like, what's going on? They show me a log file and we realize the static notch is no longer working.
Yeah, in my case, the other problem was the dynamic notches with those bin surge mechanism you introduced us into.
Lacks precision. Can't see.
And it was always attracted by other noise sometimes, and then it was letting through the frame resonance again, and then the flight behavior changed immediately.
That's a problem. It's a common problem. So what happens is a lot of times if it doesn't see. So a lot of times when you look in PID Toolbox at the spectrogram, you're thinking to yourself, why can't it see that? But that's what you got to keep in mind is that it's such a low resolution that it's literally can't see it.
Yeah,
We're using power spectral density in PID Toolbox, and it amplifies and shows you all the little tiny things that you just probably couldn't see in the signal anyway.
That's sometimes quite annoying, I must say. There's another noise.
Yeah, well, in essence, it can be annoying, but think about it. The way I look at it is that if it doesn't see it, it's probably not that significant either. Once it pokes its nose up high enough that it's a problem, then Betaflight dynamic notches will see it, you know. So you kind of got it. If it's below, say, minus 20 decibels in the gyro, and it's a very narrow peak, it probably just won't see it, especially if there's more active motor noise still bleeding through. Because a lot of times you'll find your notches get attracted to your first harmonic because it's the most intense. And so it's like you see this peak down here, but why is it stuck up here? Well, because the motor harmonic is still a little bit louder than that.
My motor harmonic was actually right on top of that resonance with some props, and then it was sharing, and that wasn't working until I realized I either changed props or I experiment with static notch, and both helped in the end. So I had some props with which were more aggressive, and in this case they were turning at a lower frequency, and that actually mitigated the problem. Good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky sometimes because the other thing with the notches is I believe they don't go all the way to, so if you set 20 hertz at the min frequency, say, it'll never get to 20. Right? Yeah. So and I don't even know if it'll get to the first bin, because you got to remember 20 is the low end of that bin. Like, I'm not exactly sure why it does that. I believe it doesn't look at the first bin for reasons.
Guys, Brian. Yeah, before we finish, can I ask a question?
Yeah, no problem.
I have a question about what's the peak of D-term noise we can handle, because I couldn't find any information in previous video until when I tune quad. I also look at filters. When I wobble it, we can see some noise getting higher and higher. And when I use master multiplier, more, when I added, the noise also go up. But can you tell me until what's the level, minus 10, minus 20 or 0 in power PSD graph? After which level I will see the problem?
I've had this question so many times. I think I generally say in your D term, you want to try to aim for that D term noise to be lower than about minus 10. But it doesn't mean that minus 9 or minus 5 or 0 that the world's going to come to an end. No, you have to use your own discretion there. But know this: when you're doing these wobble tests in general, you tend to get some motor noise bleeding through. I don't know why the RPM filters don't really seem to work as well when you start ramping up and down the RPM of the motors. So when you're doing this wobble test, the motors are you tend to get some motor bleed, and that tends to elevate some of the activity around that motor, that first motor harmonic, and that tends to bleed through in the D term. But when you do a normal flight, depending on how aggressive a pilot you are, then that's not going to be as intense, right? You'll have more broadband noise overall probably, but it wouldn't be as intense. So the answer to your question is very dependent upon a lot of things. For example, if I'm a racer with a little 5-inch drone, you look at any of these race log files, these pilots are aggressive on roll. Like if you look at the roll axis, it's like crazy, right? Pitch axis, hardly anything. Yaw, it's like they don't even use the yaw stick. One of the good things about racing, I guess, is you got such up tilt that you don't need yaw. So, but the point is that there's a lot of activity on roll. It's really intense. If you look at their D term on most anybody on any racing log, it's going to be well beyond minus 10 dB. Okay, so even though that's my theoretical cutoff, that's only just for you guys to kind of have some sense of where you should start thinking about whether this is a problem. Why do I say it doesn't matter what a race? Because it's a 5-inch drone. They're at a competition. They don't care if the motors get hot. They want to get through that thing and win a race, right? So you can't put a limit on anything, right? If you're a racer, there are no limits. You're basically push that thing to its nth degree to win a race. If I smoke a motor, if my arm snaps off, fuck it, right? I'm in a race, right? If you're now flying a Komodo on a 10-inch drone, you're going to have a different outlook.
And another question about like where is the noise more important, like on low frequencies or high frequencies? Because usually our graphs like goes from low frequencies and noise upper, like higher, and when we go to higher frequencies, our noise goes down.
Always
usually
goes down. That's right. So there's an internal filter on a gyro. You probably know that. There's an internal filter you didn't even know anything about. Before you got your gyro, there's an internal filter. That already creates a low pass. So the signal we get when we get our gyro information already looks like this. Low frequencies here, high frequencies here, and it looks something like this with motor noise, and this does that. And then we add a low pass, does even more of that. And then we add another low pass on the D term, does even more. That's why there's not very much in the high frequencies by the time we're done filtering, but we still have stuff in the low, in part because, well, our movement of the drone is in those low frequencies. The motor noise is going to be there. That first harmonic is going to be down here. So when you say which frequencies are worst, I don't know. And
right.
But the truth is, the frequencies that really are always going to be there are these low frequencies. And the degree to which we can get some of the undesirable low frequencies out is the task, really. That's the task.
Maybe I mean, like, if for example I have noise around like -10 at like 800 hertz, and also I have -10 at like 100 hertz. I
filtered out. So here's what you do here. The cost of filtering to 800 hertz is nothing.
Sure.
The cost of filtering to 100 is a lot. So you can just filter to 800 and get on with your day, right? So we don't have to have that question anymore. You'll always have less noise in the high frequencies if you've done your job, right? Because that stuff is easy to filter with no cost. So if you have a D-term signal that's -10 at 800 hertz, then you're not doing the right job with the low-pass filters.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, like right now I have like some peaks at like 1,200.
Yeah, but
hertz.
you're not listening to me. If you have any peaks at those points that are beyond about -20, then you're not utilizing filters right. And you want to go back and watch the videos we've talked about, because all that information, there is no cost to filtering anything above 500 hertz. When I say no cost, I mean very little cost. You can stick a PT3, 2 PT3s at 1,000 hertz. It's not going to cost you anything, and it's going to just slam anything up there out. So, so there's the challenges that we have are down in the low frequencies. It's
Yeah, I
when we get
understand.
noise down here, that's the problem. Anything above 500 hertz, it's a non-issue up there. I
I
welcome when I get a drone and it's like there's a peak at 500. I'm like, whew, that's great. This is easy to deal with.
I just moved
Yeah.
the slider, the term slider for filters, like to two, like 2.2. I mean
I
2.0.
wouldn't do that. So
And
in general, I find you don't gain a lot by having low pass filters cut off too high. But just keep in mind, if you have some really higher frequency stuff there, you can use a more intense filter, right? So like use a PT2 or PT3. So I think by default, Betaflight uses two PT1s. But suppose you had some real problems up in a higher frequency in D term. What you could do, let me just show you this. I'll just show you this. First of all, any noise, if it was high frequency or low frequency, I don't know if it matters too much. If it's beyond a certain point, it's a problem. But it turns out that we rarely have much noise beyond 500 hertz. As we show, like if I show you any spectrogram on D term, you're going to notice that it tends to go down, right? Like all of this is below -10, but especially above, say, 500 hertz, there's nothing up here, you know? It gets really squashed down because you've used so many low pass filters starting with the gyro to the D term, which uses two. And
Brian, you
so,
know
yeah,
why you don't see here the noise? Because I tried to use a black box rate like 1K. I mean the highest one, and I can see like more than 1,000. I can see like
yeah, it
2,000
depends on
hertz.
the drone. It depends on the drone.
Uh,
Yes, every drone's different.
and
So it's a little
mhm,
tiny whoop. They're gonna have noise up in the 1,000 hertz or whatever. But again, it's easy to filter.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah. So like it should be a non-issue. So if I really needed, suppose that I have this, suppose the noise from my tiny whoop is like the motor noise might start at 200 hertz, right? But suppose I have something at 1,000, then what I really need is something above this. You know, you can break this out of here, and you could go and stick that at 500, and you could stick this at like a PT3. Now, what's that going to do? It's going to slam the heck out of anything above 500 hertz. And it's going to cost me nothing.
Okay, clear.
Yeah. You specified something that is more like you were asking what's more problematic, high frequency noise or low frequency noise. That's a good question too. I didn't really answer your question specifically. I know, and I don't know, to be honest. I don't know.
And I mean like not more difficult to filter, but more problematic for
For
flight.
flight, yeah, exactly. What's going to happen? Yeah. I mean, I would predict lower frequency because I would think that the lower frequency stuff would be more apt to cause the drone to move around and wobble. Because if you get up to those high frequencies, they're going to be so rapidly changing that the motors can't update that fast enough, and so it would just generate motor heat, I would think, right? Yeah.
And also, I figure out I used your method when I just hover, and then I try to figure out my filters. And I saw one case when my second harmonic was on top of frame resonance, and it created like more noise than I expected. And what I did after it, I just put more weight on the drone just to move higher resonance. I mean harmonics, and then I can like separate like frame resonance from second harmonic or first harmonic.
Oh, that's
update.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
It was like at home. I think it's like easy solution because I cannot spin motors like so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've never seen that, but I can imagine that that's true. I think a lot of times, though, resonance frequencies are actually, I mean, if you think about
Overlaid.
resonance, a material resonates, right? If I tap, it has a frequency, right? So, so in theory, if that frequency is, say, 500 hertz, then if I whistle at 500 hertz, it should help make that resonate, That's what a resonance is. I think what happens with a true resonance is as the motor RPM approaches that resonant frequency of the material, then it amplifies it. And the way that would be manifest in the spectrogram is that, you know, you would just see noise from the
Huge peak.
motors,
Yeah.
but when it hits that frequency, it would just get more intense. And it would look like just essentially stronger motor noise.
Yeah.
But what you're suggesting in your case, for example, is that when you added weight, your motor frequency went up here and separated itself from the resonant frequency, but you could still see the resonant frequency. But what that means is the resonant frequency is active even when the motor is not at that frequency. Okay? And that happens, I guess you get both in some cases, right? But people usually miss the one I'm talking about. They don't see it because they think it's just motor noise. But if you look at your motor noise, it's not constant. Like as you increase throttle, it might find points where it gets louder and then it quiets down again. And at the points where it gets louder, it might be because the motor RPM is causing some other material to resonate at that frequency.
So he has the same example as I had, like static resonance on and then covered in the motive RPM on the same spot, like it was 180 hertz, and he now added some more weight to get higher RPMs to separate the static resonance and the motor noise from each other. Maybe you should try some different props and experiment with that also, because added weight is always using more energy and gives you less flight time.
That's true.
No. I just added weight for home test, just hover test at home, just to move
wait so
like.
you could see it. So you could see
Okay.
So got you.
Brian,
Okay.
Brian, one question about like dynamic notches. Why we cannot see more than 3 in pit toolbox?
In Betaflight 4.6, you'll be able to see all 7. But right now, part of the reason you only see 3 is because of Betaflight.
Okay. Because
they're only
box-
outputting 3 in the debug variable. Yeah.
And I have one question about the thing that you already mentioned. I mean, the situation when the RPM at some level caused vibrating on other part of the drone. Like, what will you recommend the best way to address that issue? Like, because I have the kind of issue that there was like a spectrum of RPM noise that go higher through the spectrum when I throttle up, and at some point it was like much higher than on other ones, and I have a big problem with filtering that out because I don't know what to do actually.
If the vibration is only arising when the RPM hits the specific frequency, and that resonance is at that frequency, then it should be gone.
Actually,
the RPM notches are sitting on top of it, right?
Yeah, but I think the RPM was not strong enough because like it was like flattening the signal after the filtering, but this specific point was still higher even after filtration than other part of the signal.
Show me your result. Show me.
I don't have it right now. I'm not
Okay.
prepared with that. I just recall it.
So then it means you're probably. Are you using lowering the weights?
No, I didn't touch the weight at all.
So if you're not touching the weights, then it should be filtering it. If it's not, then it's not on the RPM. It's not at the RPM of the motor. It's outside that RPM. And in that case, you have no choice but to use a dynamic notch.
Okay.
Unless it's not that intense and you can just not worry about it, right?
Ignore it. Yeah, I actually ignore it like that.
Yeah.
The easiest approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes if it's not too intense, it doesn't matter. Yeah. But it's always better to figure out where it's coming from. You know, all of this is always better if you can figure out what the mechanical issue. Yeah, if you can solve that, it's always better. But sometimes it's a lot of work.
And one common mistake.
Increasing the Q factor may help on that, or not really.
Decreasing the Q factor. Decreasing. Yeah, I thought about that. At what cost, though? Maybe, you know. So you have to be careful there. I know, with the RPM filters, especially because there's so many of them. But yeah, possibly it can help. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
One misconception is sometimes, okay, I got something filtered, and some people think now, oh, it's completely gone, but the filtered signal is just helping us to get a cleaner PID loop. The noise is still there. That's the problem sometimes with cameras, for example, which
That's
have
right.
their own.
Yeah.
I use like the 03, 04, which is even a bit more sensitive, I guess, than the 03 was, and stuff like that. So
There's an interesting point here, though, Axel. It's interesting. So it depends on the degree to which the thing that's resonating is being amplified by the PID controller. Because I've seen cases where, for example, you have a resonance in a camera. Maybe it's jiggling, and it produces this much vibration. But then when you don't filter it, it produces that much vibration in the system, in the frame itself. So the very act of simply putting a notch over it also reduces its amplification by the PID controller. Now, the degree to which that happens, there's a way of interpreting that in the data if you see it. I don't know if that's clear, but for example, I've had many cases where you have a camera vibrating, and before you've added any dynamic notches, it probably gets really high. Both the pre and the post filtered peak, noise peak goes up really high. So you look at the pre or the post, both of them are spiking at, say, 50 hertz, right? Now, when you add a notch to that, or a dynamic notch that grabs it, what happens is the post-filtered signal comes way down as expected, but the pre-filtered also comes down. Why is that? That is an indication that what you were seeing before was in part being amplified by the PID controller. And the act of removing it from the PID controller actively removed it from the entire system. Yeah. Now, in some cases, you'll have a peak like that. Pre-filtered, both are high. Post-filtered, one goes flattens out, the other one's still there. That's the case you're talking about, where you still have that vibration, right? In that case, the vibration wasn't being amplified by the PID controller. It's just there. Anyway, yeah.
you have to still deal with it on other places. That's right. Some people forget. Oh, I got it filtered. Now I'm fine. And then they look at their footage, or even try to gyroflow stabilize their footage, and they just get no proper result. And
that's right.
It's just because the noise is still there.
That's right. And that's especially with props. That's a good example of props, because depending on the propeller you use, you'll see a different magnitude of that motor noise. So like you think about that first harmonic, and you might go, okay, here's my first harmonic, and then I put it in my RPM filters and it comes down and it's gone, right? But the reality is it's still there, that first harmonic, and the intensity of that first harmonic is indicative of what's still happening across the drone, including into the camera. So you're absolutely right. When it comes to dealing with not just gyro flow, but any kind of camera related vibration issues, you have to take that into account. And something I feel like as a missed opportunity over the years with PID Toolbox is I should have been looking through all sorts of prop types. It'd be great to have some kind of setup, an in-house setup, where you could look at the magnitude of the vibration induced by various types of props. So if you could output a metric for us that's valuable, then we have lots of motor testing and prop testing in terms of thrust. Rosser does all that stuff, and lots of people have been doing that over the years. What nobody has done is a vibration magnitude test of a prop.
Or it depends on the manufacturer, for example, that it depends on the material, on the weight, on the size,
right,
on the blades.
But we have a spectrogram. Wouldn't it be nice to have props lined up in their peak motor noise, right? Something like that.
And then just pick the right one. That would be cool, yeah.
Yeah, well, you have it's going to be a trade-off between pitch, though, too, right? Because you'd have to look at thrust and peak motor noise, right? Because you're going to get more thrust with the more motor noise, but what you're looking for is the max thrust, a ratio between the maximum thrust and the lowest motor noise. That's the ideal prop, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you get that plot going, Axel? Get all your stuff going.
For
It's a lot of
6-inch
work,
props,
right?
probably. Yeah,
It's a lot of work. But maybe together with someone like Chris Roser, you know, if you want
Yeah, sure.
the toolbox you could use as your tool and
Yeah, no. Well, let's see. I mean, it's all like when I build a new drone, then and it comes to noise analysis, I always try different props, and if I pick one which I like, then I continue with that one. If I don't get on with that prop, I try to change to a different one, and most of the times I'm lucky with that, but not always. Sometimes you just lose the game.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. Very insightful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for your time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Take care, boys. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.